Welcome to Magic Arcanum. I'm Ryan Gomez. Behind the camera is Nicole Letson, and we're so glad you're here because it's story time. All right, I must be honest with you. This episode was completed weeks ago, but before we could publish it, Wizards of the Coast threw us a curveball, and, well, here we are. Slivers had not been seen in like 5 years, and our original script ended with me speculating on their return, but it just so happens they are in Modern Horizons, so it was worth redoing the video to work that in. Now, just like when we did the Eldrazi video, I must start this one by pointing out, even though Slivers are a fascinating creature type and one of the more interesting bits of Magic's history, they haven't been a part of any actual story for a while, even with these new cards. Despite this, they've been a highly requested topic here on Magic Arcanum, and as luck would have it, I recently lost a bet to my friend Amy, and I specifically owe her an explanation on what are slivers. So, this one's for you, Amy. Here we go. I do want to make one thing clear though. Slivers come from a long time ago, back when the storytelling in Magic wasn't all that great. So forgive me in advance if some facts end up distorted or, I'll say, embellished from memory. If you're new enough to Magic that you've never seen a sliver before, first of all, welcome. Second, you should know that slivers are a group of creatures that have at least two distinct looks. For most people, when I say sliver, they picture something like this guy. This is Horned Sliver from Tempest, the first set in which they appeared way back in 1997. I'm using this as my example because the art is pretty clear and we get a good sense of what these creatures look like, at least at this time in their history. He's got a sort of diamond-shaped head with horns that point back and then a long, slender body that splits into two whip-looking tails. He's only got one arm and it ends with a sharp, almost needle-like talon. So that's your average garden variety sliver, and it would be pretty unremarkable even as far as Magic creatures go, were it not for that line of text that says, all slivers gain trample. Now, newer editions of the card have updated templating and actually say all sliver creatures have trample, but the idea is the same. You see, slivers share a hive mind, and so any abilities one has can be shared with others nearby. This can also extend to your opponent's slivers should they have any on the battlefield. Meaning, Horned Sliver here has trample himself and gives it to every other sliver on your team, but also every sliver your opponent plays. Tempest gave us 10 such slivers that would share their abilities with one another, plus an artifact sliver that had no abilities of its own, but it could pick up anything its siblings offered. The artifact one is worth a closer look because its flavor text mentions Volrath, and that is where our story behind the slivers will begin. Volrath was a bad guy, the bad guy, I guess, for most of what we call the Weatherlight saga. You guys remember seeing Weatherlight in Dominaria recently? Okay, well that ship has been around a long time. And its old crew got to know Volrath pretty well back in their day. We're not focusing on that though, we just need Volrath because he's the one who finds slivers on an unnamed plane and brings them home with him to a place called Wrath. Back then, you didn't have to be a planeswalker necessarily to move between planes. Volrath wasn't a planeswalker, but he was a shapeshifter. He was fascinated by the slivers because they would adapt and change as they learned new abilities. So he wanted to study them and then use them as weapons against the Weatherlight and her crew. Wrath existed in a pocket plane adjacent to Dominaria. The Phyrexians were going to use it as a staging ground for their army and eventually invade Dominaria once Wrath grew to be big enough. But you know what? That's gonna be probably a whole nother video the next time I lose a bet. Anyway, Wrath became the transplanted home of the Sliver Queen. Volrath created metallic slivers to try and spy on her brood, and he eventually learned enough to start performing his own experiments on them. What he achieved with these experiments, nobody's really sure. The next time we saw slivers was Stronghold, and they behaved the same and they even looked the same, aside from now being multicolored. Volrath used the Sliver Queen to guard something called the Legacy, which was a collection of artifacts Karn was keen on collecting. Note that Karn wasn't a planeswalker at this point, but this gives you some idea of how long he's been around and a part of the Magic stories. Karn ends up convincing the Sliver Queen that he needs these artifacts the same way she needs her own Sliver children, so she gives them over. And that's the last time we see the Slivers for about 5 years, our time. I say our time because in the game, the story actually advances 100 years. By this point, the Slivers are all dead thanks to an event called the Wrathy Overlay and a bunch of battles that play out in the invasion block. But again, that's about the Phyrexians, and like I said, they'll get their own video someday. So it's 100 years later, and some scientists working under something called the Riptide Project find a Sliver fossil and decide to bring it back to life for further study. Obviously, these guys have not seen Jurassic Park. Riptide Replicator from Onslaught shows what happens when you get so preoccupied with what you can do that you forget to ask yourself what you should do. Their little island lab quickly became overrun by Slivers since these Riptide scientists did not understand the importance of having a Sliver Queen to keep the brood under control. Team Riptide pretty much all gets killed, and then the Slivers make their way onto the mainland. I want to pause here for a moment and pour one out for Riptide chronologists, because my own brother believes this is my magic doppelganger. Thanks, Keith. Without a queen to follow, the Slivers instead were drawn to the energy waves coming from the Mirari, an immensely powerful artifact that happened to be present at the time. Magic really loves its immensely powerful artifacts. The Mirari also has connections to Karn, so he's still around and kicking, but that is a thread to tug on another time. The Slivers grow at an accelerated rate under the influence of the Mirari, but they don't get to put much of that newfound power into use before they once again get nearly wiped out by a giant war. Magic really loves its giant wars. Anyway, there's this magical explosion, someone named Corona shows up, there's, like glitter everywhere, and most of the Slivers are dead. The ones who survived merged together into the Sliver Overlord. As I understand it, this was originally going to be a sort of Sliver King to go along with the Sliver Queen, who had become really popular among casual players. However, a Sliver King wouldn't really fit with the established lore, and frankly, the Slivers were probably tired of living under an oppressive monarchy, so we get an Overlord instead. The Slivers then take another break from showing up in sets, this time lasting about 3 years, before their return in a block that already had everything else going for it, so why not add Slivers? Time Spiral, Planar Chaos, and Future Sight gave us like 40 more Sliver cards, which is way too many to put on the screen here, but make sure you hit the link beneath this video, which will take you to a TCGplayer page that has all the cards from this era. I do want to call out a few of the more interesting ones though. The Hive Stone is an artifact that makes all creatures you control into Slivers, and it tells us that it was used back on Wrath to help keep those imported Slivers under control. I'm not sure how turning everything in your army into a Sliver is supposed to represent keeping them under control, but perhaps Volrath knew something I do not. We also get Vencer Sliver, which is another artifact, and thus artificial Sliver, designed to help study the real ones. This kind of reminds me of the saying, those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. Every time the Slivers show up in Magic, somebody is there trying to study them, control them, or worse, weaponize them. And every time it ends badly, especially for the Slivers. Maybe Whatley should go around the multiverse just giving out free copies of Jurassic Park. That seems pretty on brand for her, you know? Anyway, the last card I want to highlight here is Sliver Legion, yet another 5-color legendary creature you can use to helm your Sliver Commander deck. By the end of this video, you'll have more Sliver Commander choices than I have reasonable Gorgon Commander choices, and I'm not bitter about that at all. Why do you ask? The Legion's flavor text foreshadows an important development in the biology of the Sliver Hive. The Slivers are on their way towards no longer needing a queen or any sort of central leadership to organize their hive mind. And if each Sliver achieved its own form of awareness and independent thought, well then they could evolve in all sorts of interesting new ways, right? So how did Magic decide to reward loyal Sliver fans who patiently waited for this storyline to play out? Well, after 6 long years, Slivers finally returned in Magic 2014, a core set of all places. They had indeed gone through some changes, but I think for the most part, it wasn't what fans expected. Check it out. Here's Ground Shaker Sliver, an updated take on our old friend Horn Sliver. I'm sure Ristic Studies would have a more elegant way of explaining the visual differences, but I majored in communications and not art. So I'll just say this. What the f-
Okay, Ryan had to take a minute to calm down. He's a bit tied up.
Nicole, get me out of this chair.
But
no, they deserve to know the truth. Do you see those things? Those are abominations. Those shouldn't be slivers.
Cool,
Get me out of
if
here.
you ask me.
Untie me.
Anyway, here's Ryan.
Sorry about that. Okay, anyway, aesthetics aside, check out what else is different. These new Slivers don't even behave like the old ones. Notice how they say Slivers you control. One of the most fun and memorable parts of Slivers was how they'd snowball into wacky combinations you'd never expect, thanks to your opponent's Slivers feeding your own, and vice versa. Or you could punish your opponent by playing Plague Sliver, or just use artifact Slivers to soak up abilities without giving your opponent any. The interactive gameplay came at a cost, however. In design terms, the old Slivers were responsible for a lot of what we called onboard complexity, because you had to continually check and recheck what exactly your own Slivers could do at any given moment, not to mention your opponents if they had any. By retooling the Slivers to only care about your own side of the battlefield, they became much easier to track, especially during things like a draft or, say, maybe pre-release for a core set, because those are aimed at newer players especially. We got one more injection of Slivers a year later with Magic 2015, again being a core set. A fourth 5-color legendary Sliver, the Hive Lord, now gives you another commander option, while the rare Sliver land teased a potential return to their original look. And now, after another 5-year gap, the Slivers return in Modern Horizon. They're back to their old aesthetic, but they still only affect fellow Slivers you control. Why do they do this to me? I don't even... These new, modern Slivers are mostly focused in red and white, but each color gets at least one. And more importantly, Commander players have yet another option for their deck, which I guess is fair since the older ones are getting kind of hard to find. Unfortunately, Modern Horizons doesn't have any story tied to it, so we're no closer to knowing where Slivers originally came from or what created this first one. Perhaps someday the mystery will be solved, but will it take another 5 years? And what do you think Slivers will look like when we see them again? Let me know in the comments, and then like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the great stories you'll only find here on Magic Arcanum. I'll see ya.